by Joseph Pierce, literature, what every Catholic should know. Have you seen this, Bob? Yeah. And he says, why should every Catholic know why should every Catholic know about literature? Then he goes through a whole series of the epics of Homer and Virgil, Boethius de Beowulf, Dante, Chaucer, Thomas More, Shakespeare, Cervantes, the metaphysical poets, Milton and Dryden, romantic poems, feminine genius, the muse betrothed Manzoni, the Victorian age, French literature, Russian literature. But if you want to have at least sort of a Renaissance gentleman's acquaintance with things, or maybe to pique your curiosity about, well, this might be something interesting to read. Or if you just want to appear intelligent at a cocktail party, just throw out one or two lines about a particular work. How many of you have ever read Moliere's Le Bourgeois Gentilhomme, the Bourgeois Gentleman? I mean, it's a great, of course, he's a satirical dramatist, and comedy of manners, and he would be putting these terrible depictions of the nouveau riche on the stage, making them look incredibly stupid, and they're sitting in the audience laughing at it, but laughing at yourself. But he's in the Bourgeois Gentilhomme. There's a guy who comes into money, and he hires a tutor to make him intelligent. Okay, which obviously is mission impossible. And the tutor one day says to him, "Now, sir, there are two types of literature: poetry and prose." And he starts to explain the differences between poetry and prose. And he said, "Do you understand that now?" And he said, "Yes, and to think, my whole life long I've been speaking prose and never knew it." But this is worthwhile. This comes from Ignatius Press. Any of the stuff that Pierce does is worth it. But I thought, in light of what we've been talking about, this would be very helpful. So, okay. So we want to talk about your writing. Oh, I'm sorry. One more article from First Things. Where did First Things disappear? Did he leave? Oh, okay. By Dana Gioia, we were talking about him earlier today, called The Catholic Writer Today. And this was done in December 2013 edition. But very, very good. And it was just too many pages to, yeah.
There's a book there. I have it upstairs if you want me to run. It's Dana Gioia's collected writings on Catholic writers.
Oh, bring it to the next session, yeah. And so The Catholic Writer Today, and the subtitle, Catholic Writers Must Renovate and Reoccupy Their Own Tradition. Very, very well done. It kind of gives you a good mission statement. So, any questions about any of that material? All right, now we want to get into some of your concerns. I would say, in this, just as a follow-up to this morning, about you'll have to learn how to preach without being preachy and to teach without being pedantic. I think maybe that's what Fran was saying about, don't have piety get in the way of these things, all right? And there are certain things that can be said within the family of the church that are not appropriate to speak about outside the church. And I'm not talking about military secrets or anything. I'm talking about there are certain things that we can say to each other that mean something to us and are incomprehensible or confusing to people outside. All right. Newman makes an interesting distinction in Mariology between doctrine and devotion. He said the language of doctrine is very clinical, cold, calculating. Right. The language of devotion is, more romantic. Huh? And then he further distinguishes, he would have been a good Dominican, he further distinguishes that there are two kinds of devotion, he says. Italian devotion and Irish and English devotion. Well, this is like from cold ice to, you know, a boiling pot. Totally different approaches to things. But again, and he says, but there are certain things that you would say, for example, in a love letter, that you would never want anyone else to read. Not that you said anything wrong. So there's something between her and me, but we understand this in a particular way. And he uses that. So I think, again, it's going to, you know, who's your audience? You don't write in a vacuum. So who's your audience? What's the target? And make sure that, you know, everything that you're crafting moves in that direction. So who wants to talk to us about a writing project? Okay,
Publish would be okay.
I'm sorry?
Publish would be okay. Yeah,
Speak up.
I may have left a few of these outside, but two.
And by the way, let's set a 7-minute limit, okay?
Okay.
Don't push the envelope.
Okay. It's concerned, well, what I'll do is publish the copy of 2005. And follow up with a year and a few months later. And I'll read the first paragraph. I think the first paragraph you actually does, I didn't realize that what someone had said is important piece of trying to add, and I hope. In current battles between church and state about healthcare and health insurance, it's hot like that too. It is often the poor and the uninsured who end up in unintended casualties. A recent episode in Kentucky illustrates how this happens and just how much it takes. I'll read this. At the end of last year, so that was 2011, the state Democratic governor, Steve Bashir, rejected the merger of University of Louisville Hospital Medical Center, or UMC, with Jewish Hospital, St. Mary's Healthcare, and St. Joseph's Healthcare, claiming that such merger could violate the First Amendment by forcing what had been a public hospital to abide by the restrictions of a religious institution. Catholic Health Initiatives, which described itself as a ministry of the Catholic Church, was to manage the new healthcare network and to own 70% of it. Any healthcare organization that this is in parentheses, managed by a Catholic institution must adhere to the ethical and religious directives on healthcare of the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops. Directives that exclude services available in some non-Catholic countries. Basically, what happened, I should say that I do have a personal interest, passion, and experience with it. I've been in Kentucky for 23 years, even though I wrote this one. And I had an operation at Jewish Hospital, which was a very good hospital. And I also, when talking about messy lives, like messy part of my life, when I didn't have health insurance, I couldn't pay for the Louisville Hospital Medical Center performed this serious medical emergency service on me, and I didn't have to pay. So there was also, so I knew this both personally and I'll read the last. There are no doubt good reasons to scrutinize a proposal for such an unprecedented merger. It was unwise, however, for Governor Bashir to reject the merger outright, even as the state was planning to cut public funding for UNC, University Medical Center. This inflexibility will not hurt Catholic health clinicians, but it probably will hurt the indigent, uninsured population USMC has served. As long as legal medical procedures can't provide or available somewhere else in legal, the government should not stand in the way of an effort to save a hospital the state has long been neglected. People can get contraceptives anywhere, but UMC is the only hospital in Louisville that the poor can afford. The government needs a better reason for their funds. Then, I don't know, I'm sure that someone played a little bit in his mind. Through some negotiation, et cetera, about a little bit over a year later, he did. And they did make a compromise where two procedures, two ligation and contraceptives. The contraceptives would be available in pharmacy nearby, and tubal ligation would be available in the hospital adjacent to and then and I wrote about that. I wrote a follow-up about a year and 3 months later. This was called Kentucky Care Package, and this was called Kentucky Care Package approved. So, anyway, any questions on that?
Any comments that came in subsequent issues from readers?
Oh, yes. I don't have them. Most of them were in favor. Commonly, although, it's fairly liberal. And there are some people who say, oh, well, now the Catholic hospitals, one of the very good public hospitals, they have to follow. It's like, yes. Someone was talking to like, lunch, and someone said, well, that, and they come today, you don't have limit terms. It's not true. As bad as it was, 7 years ago, it's 10 times worse now. And this has happened with other candidates. Other thing I have to say, again, is, as I said, if you write about something you have personal interest in, it usually comes out. And yes, it was written and rewritten and rewritten and rewritten many times before it was submitted. And it still was edited a little bit, not too much. And this was the second thing I was very lucky. The first piece that I sent was national publication.
And just to underscore, I've guided a lot of doctoral dissertations over the years. If I've been fortunate enough, and the candidate's been fortunate enough, that I've been in on the ground floor of it. First thing I say is, make sure you write about something that interests you. Right? So, sometimes people take a shortcut and say, oh, well, a professor said this is, it would be something that people might like. If you don't like it, it's not just like, but the word is really committed to it, it's not going to work. And, you have all kinds of people that we call ABTs, you know what that is? All but dissertation, and largely it's because they didn't get the project, it's because they didn't get the project finished, but often enough it's because they lost interest in it themselves even.
And when you say as a editor, we'll talk a little bit about this amongst. I particularly liked, as you read the first two sentences, particularly at the leader end. First sentence ends with casualties. The second sentence ends with what's at stake. Let me just say, we've talked in the past about tonalities, the reverberations that exist in words. You really want to be able to come down. Every sentence needs to be taught. T-A-U-T. T-A-U-T. It has to be taught, and especially those first, in a short piece like this, those first couple of sentences are make or break. I think casualties is a little soft, but it's okay. The way you just read it, it came out fine. And then that second sentence really brought it home. What was at stake? So look at those things, and the editor will look precisely for that. Do you have some point you can make in the first 50 words? Because if you can't, probably you don't have a point. You don't have a clear idea of what your point is. One other thing I would suggest as a help to writers is specifically when you're dealing with material, because once you get into it, it gets very complicated. What's happening here, this hospital, legal questions and whatnot. Sometimes the best way to see if that is clear is to read it out loud to yourself. If you haven't developed as a writer a way of hearing your own words as you put them down on paper, sometimes physically speaking them out, you'll notice. I tell my writers the Catholic thing this all the time. There are certain slow phrases. You know, you're treading water there, and you're kind of floating through that. Get rid of those. You know, get to the point. Make each sentence move towards the final conclusion. Moving ahead with every single thing that you put down. And I thought that worked rather well the way you read it. And despite the fact, as I say, that's a complicated situation to explain. Those are the kind of things that, you know, a good editor, they'll point this out to you, and the more you work at it, the better it will be.
This is point about reading out loud. You know, many people either forget or don't know that in the ancient world, the only way of reading was out loud, right? What's the passage in the New Testament that proves that? Luke is right, but it's not the gospel. It's Philip and the Ethiopian eunuch. Remember, the eunuch is in the chariot. He's reading. Well, how does Philip know that he's reading the suffering servant passage? Someone said, oh, divine revelation. It's ridiculous. No, because the eunuch was reading it out loud, and Philip heard it, okay? And again, you know, sometimes this is even a liturgical issue. I go crazy with these wacky liturgists who say, during the scripture readings, the people should be fixated on the lector or the deacon. No. Read the darn passage in front of you, okay, from a missal, all right? Why? Because the more senses that are involved, the greater the comprehension, right? So, yeah, I'm hearing it, but I'm also reading it at the same time. And I do this with my homilies on a regular basis. And with a homily, it's particularly important because you are going to deliver it out loud, all right? And you know, do you stumble over a phrase here? Well, you're going to stumble over it when you deliver it too, okay? So, yeah, reading it out loud is one. And giving it to other people to look at, right? I think it's critically important. I do this all the time with stuff that I write. Even, you know, I have just something under the gun, it's got to be done quickly. I regret that I don't have the opportunity to pass it by someone else. Yeah.
I'm very lucky. My wife,
Oh, she'll be critical. That's good. Yeah.
yeah, she's a lawyer, vice division. She's a PhD in American composition, teaches writing, both the undergraduate and graduate level. And so I have a live-in editor. And I'm her first editor. And she's had what you were saying about reading out loud. She's had 6 books published by me. History afternoon. And I know how she works because I'm living with her. She reads out loud, whether it's poetry that she's writing or a magazine article. She does that, and she has me listen to her read it out loud. So, you know, from her, I don't even know what I'm saying here. It's a real good thing. May I add something else about my own writing?
You're over time by 4 minutes already. We're going to give you the
One
gong.
minute. I just want to reiterate, I don't think, now that you mentioned it, on reflection, I probably have had, you know, I've only been back to writing about 9 years. Probably have 20 things published maybe. I don't think there's anything that I didn't write about that somehow or another I touched. It wasn't subtitled. My first piece, I was listening to a sermon, homily, at our church, and the priest happened to be also a chaplain for many, many years. He was talking, when lamenting, part of this was that the government of New York, the bill tightening, was going to eliminate or at least reduce chaplains. I said, that's not a whole thing. So I talked to him and he gave me some information, I did some research. I said, I'll try to get the common room. I think pretty much. But I think you do need to have that person.
Next, Victor. Come on, you're the one who wants to do this.
Alright,
All right.
I can pass down the card that I wrote.
Nothing like a grand entrance, you know? He's here. He's arrived.
All unexpected, and I'm causing them to continue.
Do you want me to read it out loud or just sort of summarize it?
Well, why don't we do the same routine? Read the opening paragraph.
Okay,
Give us a 3-sentence summary of it.
okay,
Read the opening, read the closing.
okay, that sounds good. Okay, so my article's on Saint Giuseppe Mascati.
Nice and loud.
Sorry. My article is on Saint Giuseppe Mascati, the Italian doctor saint. He's beginning. Saint Giuseppe Mascati, an early 20th century Italian doctor, professor, and scientist, lived a life completely dedicated to love of God and neighbor. St. John Paul II said that he appears to us as a concrete realization of the ideal of the Christian layman.
Where was this published? by the way?
This was published in Novena magazine. It's a magazine in England. Catholic Times, a newspaper over there. It's like the magazine they publish. And at any rate, so I kind of summarized his life and made some reflections on it. And I have quotes from some of his letters. And then I concluded it basically by saying St. Giuseppe continues to heal people today through his intercession, assisting us with our spiritual and physical needs, as our doctor in heaven and giving us an example of life and charity.
Reactions? Read the opening paragraph again.
Okay. Saint Giuseppe Mascati, an early 20th century Italian doctor, professor, and scientist, lived a life completely dedicated to love of God and neighbor. St. John Paul II said that he appears to us as a concrete realization of the ideal of the Christian layman.
Yeah.
Suitable or not.
Just, for me, what I appreciated how quickly you moved to the word liquidity. One more second. If you can say, if you can say, oh, I want to speak about this person, and then the second sentence, say, oh, John Paul II said this about this. Oh, yeah, you do this too. You know,
And what do you think about it in terms of the target audience? Obviously, who's the target audience here? Yeah, I mean, it's devotional material, you know? This wouldn't have been something the Commonweal would have printed, okay?
In reaction to the ending, what jumped out at me was the parentheses, including this
Oh,
one.
yeah, you repeat that.
That is a tremendous hook. I don't know what's in the middle, it's right there.
Yeah.
That is a tremendous hook right there.
I didn't really get into it, but he actually did heal me from something serious intercession. I mean, it wasn't like a major miracle or anything, but I was having a health problem and I prayed his intercession.
Why wasn't that in there?
Because what my articles meant, it's more of a, this is not that kind of magazine. It's the kind, I wanted to thank him in it, but it's the kind of magazine that really has kind of more straight biographical, not personal reflection.
In that case, why put in there at all?
Because I wanted to thank him. So
I think that's kind of a teaser.
I said I left it up to the editor. I said if you want me to spread anything more about that, I can. But if you prefer even removing it, you can. So he just said, "Look, leave it in there."
But even as, aside from what you just explained, which I fully accept,
Yeah.
it's an example of a tremendous teaser, that's a tremendous hook. That's going to get somebody to, what happened to you? Tell us about that. Even if that's not the scope of this particular article, it's the kind of thing that is a real big hook.
Okay. Yeah. But in this case, I didn't want it to be that name, but it's out
Well, I'll get you on Dr. Phil. Anything else on that? Okay, next. All right, Father.
So, I'm myself. What's that? Great.
No.
Oh, okay. So it's creative writing. I'm just gonna list two paragraphs, if you will. Both describe the town in different parts of the novel. The town is a conglomeration of everywhere where I'm from in Western Pennsylvania, but the short and the quick of it is that I want the story to be a retelling, but not I don't like that idea. It's not a straight retelling, but a transposition of the lives of Saints Chrysanthus and Daria, their ancient Roman martyrs, onto the modern world. If Chrysanthus and Daria were before their baptism and conversion, if they were dropped into Pittsburgh, what would happen? However, it's a little further in the future, and the only vestige of the church, capital C, is a church building in this town, and it's closed down. And there are people who have they're squatters who have taken it over, and you find out throughout time, it's called Old St. Pete's. The town is Edirna, the eternal city, but Edirna, Old St. Pete's, and the people revive the faith, but without using the name of Jesus, without using even the word church. They, it's just funny what we mentioned last night. They actually evoke someone brings a copy of Moby Dick, and they start using the imagery of Moby Dick to explain religious sentiment or to express. And if you look into the maritime imagery of the ancient church, I forget which church father, but he called his followers "my little fishes." You know, so I call him Chris. It's not me, but Saint Chrysanthus. Every twist and wash of clay was still littered for those who took the time to look, with Monongahela stone points, Adena and Hopo along them, drilled from the shells of freshwater mussels still littering the nearby banks, flushed with purple, bits of slag like a volcano's leavings, bird feathers, globs of waste glass from the old Fry Brothers works, and more. Things either unspeakable or unknowable outside their time or calloused owners' hands, pestles and corn grinders used for ancient generations, loved, even given names like stone infants, again forever discarded to be mistaken for simple river weeds. A bit to the southwest, where the Little Wyandotte began its tumble down a shallow stone staircase into the Ohio, stood what little remained of the old German brewery, oldest buildings still standing in town, brickwork like a wedding cake, witness to the pass of chugging riverboats and horse-powered ferries, giving way to men on the moon and genetic editing. To the north, where the Big Wyandotte slid itself, lazy as an old hound, past old locks into the Ohio, lay a flat slip of raised floodplain where a race of giants, already called ancient by Shawnee and Delaware and Mingo, had housed their dead in mounds of earth and rock. Stone progeny too, these, all leveled now beneath hoofbeat, spade metal, highway, and car lots, spread evenly like paw marks of a giant pacing cat up and down the rusted valley. And there, on a blunt spur of land midway between the Big and Little Wyandottes, beyond rail lines and through a tunnel beneath the state route bypass that had itself spelled doom for Edirna's once thriving downtown, last address along a broad brick avenue yet sutured with trolley tracks and railroad shunting lines, running brick by brick straight into the river's triune convergence, stood the old Imperium Hotel, perched like some weathered crocodile sunning itself along the shore, always watching, about to slink away into the current at the slightest provocation, its salty belly already swelled with the pale bones and plans of Edirna's children. Later on, for more than 150 years, this had been the thriving heart and belly of Edirna. Wagon rights and coke-killed men had walked here, riverboat stewards, itinerant umbrella repairers, and rag sellers too. Anarchist bombers and the judges they stalked, Men with bushy mustaches, Gibson girls with mouths of hair, faux debutantes, impoverished, cavities filled with candle lights. Minor Scotch-Irish aristocracy grown fat and lazy on the bronze shoulders of Big Joe Magaran, who is a local folk hero. A slew of Chinese laborers, Mertenberg utopians, glassblowers, druggists, and railroaders. Waves of Germans from farm country to the north and east. Inundations of Irish, then Serbs, Poles, Croats, Czechs, Italians, and Slovaks, Hungarians and Russians in smaller numbers, and Jim Crow refugees to boot. Clan bonfires, KKK clan. Bonfires lighted on the hills overlooking town, futile as the Shawnee war fires before them, warning all of these foreigners away. Victorian mansions and stables built pretty as morning pastries, boarding houses and mill homes, which were themselves palaces for families whose native languages had ever lacked a word for shoes. One-room day houses, too, where men who lived out of walking distance could grab 4 hours sleep before the next shift whistle sounded from the Bessemer furnace. Debooted feet lined up around the wood stove like fish crackling on a grill. Kind old hill hermits and wise women of the wooded hollows, chased away by the steam-powered bulldozers, brothels and speakeasies, whiskey stills and steel mills, the latter which seemed to have drilled into the core of the world to spew out the guts of hell. Buckets of molten slag poured into the Ohio day and night, precise appearance of lava, changing geography laid by glaciers when mammoths still poked about the world, playing Vesuvius with Monongahela bows. After sundown, the sheer dynamited cliffs of the river valleys were said to have glowed a fierce and immodest red. I've never read anything aloud before. I mean, to anyone else.
Yeah.
Well,
What's the first thing that strikes you about it?
It's the cadence and the sound of the words, like the magical.
There's something before that even, I think.
I'm sorry.
What?
Oh, the visual imagery.
The visuals, yeah.
You can
I mean,
picture it.
you see, I mean, the whole picture is painted for you.
Lay down now?
I think we're recording that, aren't we?
Yeah.
Oh, no.
What happens in the middle of the story there? You read like the beginning, maybe the end or something. What's in between there? Is there,
Oh,
is there
so
dialogue? or something?
Oh, yeah. I mean, this
Okay,
isn't a
yeah.
short story, it's a novel, so I
Oh,
just
I
left it
see.
two
Okay.
paragraphs. Oh, yeah, there's a whole bunch.
I like the continuity in there, with the naming of Indian names, labels with things, and then, siding with landscape, kind of moving over time, but, those things evolve into or how those things can change. And it's a real sense of time having passed it, and wonderful. I'll probably feel it.
You heard that.
What is the function of the role description? It's a great American kind of presentation, how much diversity, layering and whatnot is there. So what purpose does that serve in the actual fiction?
Oh.
Kind of explain it.
Yeah, so Chris, the character, is just hyper aware of the past in a way that everyone around him has forgotten. He can tap into. It's nothing extra, it's nothing supernatural, if you will, maybe. But he knows, he remembers. At some points, he's like the only one who still remembers different stories. Like, about what happened on this street or with this building. And he's just carrying that the whole time. And that goes into a lot of people's expectations of him. He's just carrying it all. And when he meets these people who have taken back the church building, they kind of just put that down now. We could baptize that and make it new and make you new. And there's other people in his family and in his professional life, if you will, who are trying to pull him back and say, no, you need to be the one to save all of this yourself.
The reason I ask is I think that there's a temptation that we have to write, not saying that description, if you read, I like that, was very beautiful. I think extremely rich and you have an obvious talent. And I find that a lot of American writers think that they can kind of coast on the fact that there's so much kind of chaos that leads to kind of fireworks when you put it into words, but it doesn't move toward any, but the chaos itself is kind of all that they're really. I think that's, I hope you finished it.
Thank you, honestly, thank you all, because like, this was like the most horrifying thing of my life.
Where you just came out.
Oh. Oh, thank you.
Now can we go around and be honest about it?
Please no.
Okay, yes, no,
I had a moment like yours, that kind of ties into what I'm writing about, so. you know,
The sick part, or you mean
What's that?
being sick?
No, actually, that part, yeah. I've been working at Graduate Volunteering for hospice for like, since, the year 2000. And I enjoyed it the first few years. I thought, okay, I'm gonna get more deep into this. So I went to their training that was more extensive, and I was just horrified. It was taught, this was about 10 years ago, and it was taught by a lesbian who was married to a woman before that was a thing, and was telling us how first graders need to be indoctrinated in this sort of thing. And at the time I said, oh, that can never happen. And it was a lot of new age spirituality. They pretty much confessed that they dehydrate people to death. I was introduced to the non-heart beating organ donation. The way this woman who's teaching the class was explaining it.
did you see that story this past week of the German nurse? But 825 people that he killed.
Wow.
Document 825. Who knows how many more?
The woman who was teaching the class was explaining that if you're donating a non-paired organ, it needs to be engorged with blood and oxygen. And I thought to myself, that sounds like a lie. And from the research I did online, it is. She even played a song that kind of mocked Christians for, criticizing what she does because your God says it's wrong. And there's more. But I was just shocked and horrified, and I went to my spiritual director to express my outrageous outrage, and said, I'm going to quit, and I'm going to tell him why. And he said, don't you do that. You subvert him from the inside. And so, against my desires, I went for even more training when it was for spiritual care was the heading, and it was even more new age stuff. And we were getting towards the end, and I, kept how did you say it? Keep your head low. And she said, for our last project, I want you to, we're going to pair you up, and you're going to tell your partner about a time you faced death. And I said, okay. I faced death once, and I went to my spiritual director, and I said, okay, I've never told anybody this story before. I found the fullness of my faith, and it was a hard thing. And I thought I just kind of put that in the past, glad that's resolved. But this is an occasion. Oh, that's specifically why. There were two nuns in this class, the spiritual care class. One wrote her own song, which pretty much was a testament to climate change. The other one was a lesbian who left the convent for her girlfriend. And in my naivete, I said, okay, I'm going to pair up with that nun. And when she hears my great story, she is going to put her veil back on and say, what a mistake I made,
Yeah, good.
But they pulled a fast one and decided that we're going to tell it to the whole class. And God bless my spiritual director. I told him the whole story in an hour, and he looked at me with what I thought was horror. But when I was all done, he said, you have to get this story published, and gave me a magazine editor's contact, and I submitted it, and they published it within, I think, 3 weeks. But,
What's the magazine?
it was called This Rough at the time. Now it's called Catholic Answers.
Yeah.
So I went to this meeting where we're going to talk about it out loud, for everybody. And pretty much everybody in the room was not hostile to Catholics, but to what Catholic morality is. They were quite vocal about it, so I figured they'd hang me from the nearest tree. So I was about to
Well, they say about the New York Times. But the New York Times, the only good Catholic is a bad Catholic.
But I knew I wouldn't be able to say it from memory. I'd be just too nervous. So I just wrote it on front and back of a piece of paper, and I'm not going to read it to you now. It was poor writing, but it was trying to condense a lifetime of lessons in 2 pages. And I expected a lot of hostility. When I was done, I thought they were gonna put me on their shoulders and shout hip hip hooray. They loved it. And this is the irony. Like at the end, everyone had to come up and tell me. As a matter of fact, the guy that I was most afraid of, because he had these angry blue eyes that flashed like a gas flame whenever you contradicted him. He was sitting so close to me that the skin on his arm was against mine. And when I was done, and we were all
I'd
getting
sue him.
at the end of the story, he grabbed my arm and he leaned in and he said, "It's very important to say things like that." And at the end of it all, ironically, if I had done it the way I wanted originally, I would have just told that one nun. And everybody was telling me how much I said, and then one nun I wanted to tell it to said, "You know what, dear, you should save that letter and in 10 years read it again." Meaning, and that was 10 years ago, so Jesus is, meaning, of course, you won't believe that. So
Right.
very well. So I did some speeches in RCIA, and the reaction was pretty much similar. But this is such a good story that this particular reaction is, I have to tell it. My pastor was a liberal, and he was never around for the RCIA speeches, but this one particular time he was. And as you mentioned, the RCIA catechesis is abysmal, and this was rock bottom bad. So I just tried in my speeches to get as much as I could out there. And I mean, heaven, hell, death, sex, anything I could say politely and clearly, I gave it to them. And I gave them a book called Did Adam and Eve Have Belly Buttons? And it's kind of like Baltimore Catechism, but a little more modern. And I had my little stack of those books on my desk. He was standing next to me. I'm sitting, and he's glowering down at me. And he said, "So, this is the book I've heard so much about." And I thought, okay, he's going to hang me from the nearest tree when I'm done telling this story. And when I was done, he left from his chair and said, "Wonderful witness," and picked up the book and said, "This is a great book." I mean, he was so overcome. Apparently, I have a story. I never intended to write anything about it, but I've been telling excerpts of it to my family, and my niece who said, I don't even want to hear the name Jesus in it. I sent her the last chapter, and she said, "I beg you, send me more." I'm an engineer, not a writer, and I am absolutely I'm overcome with the insurmountable task. But if you'd like to hear the gist, it's a little crazy, but the theme is that
1 minute.
1 minute. The theme is that I overcame my fear of war by coming to view all of life as a war. And I'll just skip to the end. You say the end is important. When I was at the height of my anxiety, I thought, my parents are the last two good people in the world that I know. They're saintly goofballs, which was a wonderful way to grow up. It was all by example and not by.
You're editorializing. Read.
Sorry. Oh, I didn't write it down, but the gist is that my father died 3 years ago, and we found him, and ironically, shoot, now I'm forgetting my point. I'm sorry. The last words that I said to my father is, "Well done, soldier. I will fight on." That's how I came to overcome my greatest fears in life, is by coming to see the whole life as a war. But there's so many good stories buried in there, and people are begging me to write this. So yeah, that's it. I'm done.
Right?
Yeah.
It doesn't always turn out like that. Though.
What does it?
It doesn't always happen that way, by the way.
Oh.
So be ready for the direct confrontation.
Oh, I'm sure of it. I'm sure of it.
A lot
Yeah.
of it is not going to be, "Oh yeah, put that in talk to me."
And I'm aware of it. Yeah.
You talked about the lesbian situation. I was telling some of you last night, I've gotten a real wake-up call. I've been involved with some student-teacher evaluations from Grand Canyon University, which is an evangelical institution, which have brought me into public schools, which I prefer to call government schools or state schools. At any rate, I was evaluating a student teacher in a kindergarten class in suburbia. And while I was watching her, there was a pile of books next to me for the children to read, kindergarten. And the book on top was Heather Has Two Mommies. Kindergarten. Starts that soon. That's
Can I put out one request? I hate the title, I've worked under 2 titles. The first title was The Prepper's Guide to Happiness. Second title was, that I'm currently working under, is The Girl Who Saw Tomorrow. I don't know if there's a great biblical allusion to war that I could use. I'm sure there are, but none of them, I want something that creates a visual, I don't know, that would grab you. But, so if anybody has any great ideas,
You're talking about book line.
yes.
I must say, I've probably chosen only 1 or 2 titles for any of the 40+ books I've written. I'm not good at it. Some people have a catchy way about it. So,
Can I ask who's your target audience?
Honestly, my loved ones at the moment, but the wider audience seems to really like it. So I don't know, maybe something will come of it, but it seems like memoir would be kind of a hard sell. I don't know. But if all I did was give it to my loved ones, I would consider myself a success.
well, that's what we have Create Space for. On the hospice front, when it's good, it's very good, and when it's not. And my mother was in hospice care actually 3 times, and she bounced back every time, like the Energizer Bunny. And but I had her in a wonderful Catholic home with great sisters running the place and so forth. I went in to visit her one time, and there was a man in there talking to her, and I said, "Oh." He said, "Oh, are you her son?" It's kind of an interesting way to introduce yourself. "I'm Deacon Joe, and I'm a hospice chaplain." And so my mother's sitting there, and he said, "You know, you better start making funeral arrangements." And I said, "Get out in the hall." He said, "Oh, she doesn't know what's going on. Don't worry." I said, "Get out in the hall. Get out in the hall." I brought him to the nurse's station, and I said, "This man is never, ever to cross the boundary of my mother's room." I went back into my mother, and she said, "Who was that nut that wanted to bury me?"
Hearing is the last sense to go.
Well, that's why, when in the training of priests, for example, for administering the sacrament of the sick, you are told, if the person is even apparently unconscious, speak directly into the person's ear, because it is the last sense. So, but I think we're going to find a lot of necessity for writing about these end-of-life things, and they're getting. Did you see the latest? There's this pod that people can purchase now. It's a life-size pod, and you crawl into it and put the cover over and press a button and euthanize yourself. But it also has a great second use. It can become your coffin as well. Okay? And then, of course, if you live in Washington State, now you can have yourself made into compost.
Right.
So, someone, yeah.
Hi. I think this kind of segues into the whole conversation, which is why I was eager to talk about it. But this is the latest thing I've had published, and a lot of the things that I write about are usually prompted by some real life scenario. And my son is a school teacher. He was working in a public school last year. He was teaching 9th grade, and he was teaching of mice and men, which is it's always been like a pet peeve of mine. And I had just come off of an experience like that. A close family friend was in hospice, and the family members think she was given too much of a dose of morphine. She was put on the morphine drip, and they often tend to not wake up after that. And my mother had stayed in the hospital with her overnight, and she saw a nurse come in and, add to the intravenous that was connected to her on. So, but there's been other things that have happened as well. So, my son and I spoke a lot about of mice and men, and I started to think of, the effects that all this literature, has had on young people, and the age that it's geared toward is getting younger and younger. So, and I, obviously as someone's fan too, so I wanted to come up with something that would capture people's attention. So I wrote an article called Of Mice and Men Without Chests. And I'll just read a little bit of it. So At first glance, one might surmise that the title of this article alludes to the characters in John Steinbeck's classic. Truthfully, while reading Of Mice and Men, I grew to like the characters and found myself empathizing with some of their hardships. A good author is able to pull his readers into the world of his characters. While C.S. Lewis's metaphor, Men Without Chests, could be ascribed to the characters in Of Mice and Men, a more critical concern at hand is the impression the novel has made on young readers for more than a half century. What has been their takeaway? How has this short yet harrowing novella affected the hearts and minds of readers in our overall culture? Why does it continue to be one of the most popular required reading selections in middle schools and high schools across America? Then I get into a short description of what Of Mice and Men is about. And you
Where
know,
was this published?
in last year,
Where?
Crisis Magazine.
Oh.
So, there's mercy killing. I don't know if you're familiar with Mice and Men in the book. So, St. John Paul II's encyclical Evangelium Vitae warns of an emerging culture actively fostered by the powerful cultural, economic, and political currents which encourage an idea of society excessively concerned with efficiency. He alerts us further to a culture which denies solidarity and in many cases takes the form of a veritable culture of death. In Pope Francis's recent apostolic exhortation, Gaudet et Exsultate, he expresses grave concern for the vulnerable infirm and elderly exposed to covert euthanasia, and the dignity of the human life, which is always sacred and demands love for each person, regardless of his or her stage of development. And presently, 68% of Americans believe in physician-assisted suicide, which is up 10 percentage points from last year. And the Down syndrome abortion rates have increased even more. Interesting that the character Lenny in Of Mice and Men was mentally and physically challenged. Then I get into, perhaps some responsibility for our culture of death lies not only in our selection of literature, but how it's taught. How teachers, we can always, like, a book that appears to oppose meritorious ideals can also be used to champion them. There's always one side. And then, I don't want to read this whole thing. So,
You have the concluding paragraph.
yeah, I'll read the concluding paragraph, but I don't know that famous, what C.S. Lewis says about men without chests. Is everyone familiar with that? So then I'll just go to the concluding paragraph. So Of Mice and Men is but one sample among the many educational tools seemingly being used to promote a nefarious agenda. Although literature is not the only societal influence that exists, we should not underestimate its power to erode the moral fiber of our culture. Tragically, it seems we have, as C.S. Lewis so accurately predicted. Let us rise up and assess what our choices have brought. What are we doing to our children, our young adults, and our overall society? Have our selections in literature enhanced our mental, spiritual, emotional well-being? Have they promoted our Judeo-Christian values and ideals? It's time to ensure that they do and to make reparation for the damage we've incurred. It's time we, the inattentive, start paying attention. And I also get into how, for a time, I didn't always scrutinize everything my children were reading. And you assume, that the schools have their best interests at heart, but not so much anymore. So, as parents and educators, we should start noticing what they're reading.
Comments about the beginning and end or the theme? Again, the audience is crisis.
I like your comment about how you can use, it's not the sense, because there's a lot of great tactical literature and it's very downbeat and seemingly, not full of characters that are worth emulating, and yet, you know, you have some of the greatest Catholic literature that shows, you know, you can use the contrast to show, to provide a truth about what's, you know, what you're trying to get across. But then it can also be used in another way, like you said.
Right. You know, you could pose questions, you know, like ask the students to come up with an alternative ending to the story, just as a practice, you know, just so they know that there can be another ending to the story.
Look back into just recent history, all these things that have caused our society trauma. We're talking about, you know, the revelations of the Holocaust caused many people even lose their faith in God, you know, the level of humans. Solzhenitsyn, his Nobel Prize, he won the Nobel Prize.
Yes.
His speech really.
The speech at Harvard.
Oh, okay, yeah. His speech at Harvard is something I think is important. But like you said, kind of almost to get it out there in a way that, you know, in the history of that T4 program by the Nazis, people would send their loved ones to institutions, medical institutions, and then they'd get ashes back. And there'd be like barrettes in the ashes. And they're like, well, this was a boy. You know, and the losing of the name, the dehumanization of, and all in the guise, under the guise of love and care and mercy.
When you talk about the loss of a name, the previous Archbishop of Paris, Ventois, is his name, in French means 23. And I was always wondering, kind of a strange name. And it turns out that he was an orphan in a Catholic orphanage. And according to French law, I seem to have an awful lot of laws about things, I'm not going to church property, but that until the age of 18, you couldn't have a surname. So you had a first name and the number on your underwear or laundry or whatever. And when he turned 18, he was asked, what name do you want? He said, I'm Ventois, 23. He decided to keep his number as his name. Interesting way of overcoming this personalization. Yeah. I've been pushing people to do a study for years. No one has bit a bullet on it, but on violence in visual forms of violence. And I have a theory. I can't prove it because I haven't done any study on it, but many of us who grew up at the beginning of the television era, there was tons of violence, cowboys and Indians and all kinds of, you know, crazy things like that. And yet none of us acted out that stuff. My theory is, if you look at contemporary violence on television or in the movies, what's the difference? It's contemporary stuff, right? And so it's, you know, it's the modern city, it's people dressed the way we dress, etc. My theory is that's one of the I think there's probably some kind of innate psychological need to enter into violence, you know, to work out some aggression in some way. But it was done previously as, well, that's what was done 150 years ago. We don't do that anymore. Whereas the violence today in the media is very contemporary. And so it becomes something that people emulate, kids in particular.
Maybe problem with the fact that the bad guys sometimes win. I guess it wasn't so common.
Of course, we weren't exactly too good about some of the violence there either, about, you know, cowboys and Indians. It wasn't always the cowboys that were the good guys. Someone had.
I just wanted to comment. I thought it was really good. I thought it would be really interesting to parents who have children who maybe aren't yet at that age, but who have younger children, just so that I feel like it would catch their attention, so that they can be aware of that. Like, oh, I got to start paying attention to what they're reading at school, whether it's public school or even honestly Catholic school, just to be on top I think if you can somehow target parents of children, they would love it.
But some parents are.
Yeah.
Parents, there's a lot more to it, there's more substance in the middle than,
Sure.
belong to get into, but thank you.
I would hope that.
Right? I'm waiting because, I'm sorry.
There you go.
It touched me because, the semester I took a course on film and Christianity and for the power of film. And I used to talk about the power of literature and the power of music. And it could be used for good and for bad. And lately we've been using it for bad. And we've got to somehow rally and start using it for good the way it used to be. Like the Sistine Chapel, the painting there, good moral stories, C.S. Lewis, whatever. We have to start writing again so that we can start teaching our young. I didn't realize how much the movies and TV really infiltrated our culture. If we're using it for bad, then the kids are gonna grow up with not a good moral foundation. And now we have to start really looking minutely at what they're watching and what's going on. So we have to tell the parents, watch what your kids are reading, watch what they're looking at, because we don't even know anymore what the schools are doing because they're not for the kids. They're for some other, they're looking for something else to teach. They're not teaching moral values or moral goodness. So we're the ones that have to be warriors for our children and we have to fight for them and make sure that they're not seeing the wrong thing.
Well, I think there are two exercises I used to use with high school kids. Was one, a kid had to pick a channel of TV to watch from 6 p.m. to 11 p.m. Right? Don't change channels, just sit there and watch this for 5 hours and tick off every time a commandment is violated. And why do I do that? Because usually, people, not just kids, everybody, you kind of lulled into it and even unconscious of what's being said and done. And they would come into school the next day and say, I realize it, the name of God was taken in vain 25 times in a 5-hour period. Fornication was either made visual or alluded to, 175 times. And then the other exercise was I made them take the 10 top rock tunes at that moment and analyze the lyrics. And the kids were shocked. I mean, they were singing this stuff, but absolutely oblivious to what they were singing, what the meaning of it was. And of course, what it does, it ruins both TV and rock for them for the rest of their lives, right? Because they become critical observers of it.
Do you think nowadays anyone would even, like, I know a lot of kids who know what it means now better than I do, but they don't care.
Well,
My youngest daughter always tells me when I tell her that this is listening to garbage. She keeps saying, like, they don't really mean it. I said, all that misogynistic rape and degradation, they don't really mean it. No, it's just a joke. But it's not. It's not. I'm doubly cynical of my scenario. I'll tell you what. I'm old enough, old enough to remember, this actually was read long before it was kind of part of this euthanizing.
Right.
So I don't think it was initially put into the school curriculum for that reason. I think it was put into the school curriculum because it's short. It's like people read The Stranger in French class because it's short. They're not going to read Balzac, they're not going to read Proust. Just too long, too hard to teach. The teachers find a nice narrow book that maybe the kids can get through. And that's what it's doing. The telling thing is that it's now turned into a threat. And you can sound puritanical when you say this, but it's gotten into every nook and cranny of the culture. You have to be extremely vigilant to try to do whatever you can about it. There's a famous Italian communist theorist, Antonio Gramsci, who's often quoted in cultural contexts favorably by people who are trying to advance progressivism, unfavorably by people who want to oppose him. He was put in jail by the fascist government in Italy and died. But he had this idea, which he said was based on the Jesuits. I believe Italian economists that during the Counter-Reformation, the Jesuits decided that they were going to advance education in the Catholic faith, and it would go into every nook and cranny of the culture. And then once it's settled into the culture as a whole, it can't be refuted because it's everywhere. It's like having the dust in the air. You can't get every part of the dust out of the air. There's a famous phrase he uses in Italian about it. He says, what we want is a revolutionary cultura capillare. A culture that's like the capillaries in your body. It goes out into every little corner. So how do you can't destroy your whole body, right? If you're fight some infection. And that's what's going on. It's a scary thing. To know how to respond to it is not very easy. But that it is happening is very, very clear. So we've got to kind of take that on consciously and recognize that is not going to go away for a long time. Father's talked about how, it wasn't all peaches and cream before Vatican II. That was the culture that's changed. And that's true, but the culture can also be an imperfect force for good. And that's what we have to try to reconstruct.
When I first started teaching as a college seminarian, an old sister was kind of guiding me through the steps, and I was 18 years old, and I looked like I was 12, and I was teaching kids who were 17, and classroom control was horrific, and I would start to scream at them and everything. And I said to her one day, I said, sister, I think they hate me. She said, yeah, I think they do, yeah. And she said, but now listen, honey, she said two things. Number one, never scream. When you're angry, whisper. She said, when you're screaming, you're giving them entertainment. They're going to do this all the more to get this. She said, number two, the task of a Catholic teacher is to make the good thing the popular thing. She said, there will always be peer pressure in one direction or another. Use it to advantage in a Catholic school, right? And I followed that regularly. I would, unwittingly, in one school, my first week there, I threw the captain of the football team out of an assembly and go for the biggest right at the beginning. And it turned out using him to come back and do the right thing. And the whole culture in the place changed in a semester. And I think at times we're so intimidated by the bigness of the problem that we tend to forget that the big problem occurred at a small level first, right? And either people ignored it or were unaware of it or whatever. And so the reform, and again, you can screw up something in an institution in a week, and it takes 10 or 15 or 20 years to fix it. And we have to have persistence about it, which you have to give the left credit on this. They are persistent and they are bold, and they really don't care who likes what. And there's nothing like a liberal dictatorship, right? And we're seeing that on a regular basis now. And there needs to be a Christian boldness in response to that, so that you're not intimidated by stupidity. And I think the other thing is very often when someone says something outrageous, is to laugh. So what? What you were joking, weren't you? But that's exactly what they used against us starting 50 years ago. And some of us are old enough to remember Billy Joel's famous Catholic girls start way too late, right? You make fun of something like virginity or chastity, right? And so that people are embarrassed. When I was going to high school, there were some kids that we thought were fooling around, as we used to say. But they didn't speak about it. And if it was spoken of, they'd say, that's trash, right? Now, the shoe's on the other foot. So someone has to be embarrassed about saving one's virginity, okay? Which I mean is for males and females alike. The church is an equal opportunity employer on that issue.
Your opinions. So the collapse, or whatever you want to call it, of our culture, church has always survived that. And Catholic literature, Catholic art, as long as we kind of take ownership back of it, start to at least even do it again. I'm using broad terms.
Well, see, first, I would question your first statement. I don't believe we've witnessed the collapse of our culture yet. I mean, the very fact that 50% of Americans hold a rather traditional line on things, right? We're not Western Europe, right? And I think Bob would agree. I mean, the situation in Western Europe, you've seen a real collapse. Europeans tend to be shocked that we still fight about things like abortion and still talk about gay marriage and all these as though they're not settled issues. And I think that's why the left has become so much more obnoxious about it, because they're nervous that this could go either way at this point. And I don't think we've crossed the line.
Collapse post-Christian. In the general sense, we were talking about that.
Yeah.
Do we write for a present or do we write for a future? Or do we write for both at the same time? There are people, like you said, Mice and Men wasn't read because of what's being read into it now. But do we try to communicate even if it's in a way that is hidden or a way that's so organic that people can't say, well, that's a Catholic. I read Flannery O'Connor and I didn't know she was a Catholic and I thought she was a man. I'd never heard the name Flannery. And I thought, wow, that story was awesome. And then I read the bio at the very end and it was like, and she's Catholic, But if you can do something like that, are you writing for the present or are you writing for the future?
I mean, I think you write for what you die for, but what comes towards you is a famous saying of Lenin's, the union ought to be interested in the party is interested in you. And don't worry, there are going to be plenty of challenges that you're going to have to respond to more and more, because there is a segment of the population right now that thinks that Catholicism as such is hated. Right? That the neuralgic moral positions that we have are hatred toward other people. It's not, I think it would not be too strong to say that it's trying to think of it as the KKK. And you don't tolerate the KKK in polite society, right? You shun it. My father is right. It's amazing that we have maybe half of the country that is still willing to push back. Europe is trying to push back too.
Yeah.
You saw these European elections a couple of weeks ago. Populist parties that are, they're a new thing. Neil Farage got the largest number of votes in England with a party that was founded 6 weeks ago. I mean, it's the most amazing thing I've ever heard of. But there's a pushback. People are just saying, we're losing our country. We don't like the culture we're living in. I hear from, I go to Europe a lot because we run programs over there, and I hear from people just what I hear from people here in the United States. I don't recognize my country anymore. I don't know what this is. I don't know where I'm going to go. I don't know where my children, how my children are going to live in this environment. And it makes people angry and it gets them voted. So there are going to be some new audiences. And part of the silence, exile, and cunning that I mentioned that James Joyce talked about is going to be, how do I speak to that group in a way that encourages them in a healthy way and not in a, there are dangers of fascism and intolerance and whatnot.
That's right.
But I would say, look, you're going to have fights pushed on you whether you want it or not. So you take them as they come.
You see an emerging, there could be an emerging audience of people who are disaffected by what they've seen in the recent past. That's what I'm asking.
I mean, if I had to predict, I think it looks better. I don't know that at this point we can stop the way that the culture is going. I'm just hoping that when it comes my time to die, I'm allowed to go to a Catholic hospice somewhere, even if it has no medicines. If they want to just hold my hand and let me die and not kill me, I'm serious. I don't want to be euthanized by the United States of America. If we have to go to the depths of Arkansas or someplace to just be allowed to die, that's what I'm going to do, because it could come to that.
Any of you nurses?
Hospice nurse, 15 years. And they actually, I've seen a turnaround in just the last couple of years. Thinking more about money and doing your paperwork rather than caring about the patients. I always, my first priority was what do they need and how can I keep them alive until God says it's time for them to go. And I never, many times I walk in and somebody would say, well, let's use that morphine, let's do it so that they don't suffer. And I said, I don't see it that way. I see it as a dance between God and the person. And they have to have a time so that they can talk to each other and communicate to each other. And when they're ready, then the person decides it's time for me to go. And I don't want to push anybody over the edge. I don't want to give them too much medication. In fact, you start with a little bit of morphine and you keep it there until you see that there's something terrible going on, and then you call the doctor and up it up a little bit more. But you don't just give a huge amount of morphine to kill the person. And they didn't, a lot of people didn't even see it as murder. They just think it's just, we don't want to see them suffer, so let's just do it outright. And I said, it's not, part of life is suffering, and part of that is talking to your maker, your creator at the time when you're close to death. And I said, you have to let that process go through until the end. You just can't stop it because you feel like it. I said, it's something personal, and this is their life, and this is their end, and they're the ones that have to coordinate it with God, not us coordinating it for them and killing them before their turn. So a couple of times, even with an elderly person who had Alzheimer's, she had been my patient for a long time, and she always communicated somehow with me, whether with music or touch, and then her daughter just didn't have the money anymore to keep her where she was, and she decided that she wanted to do some more things to kill her, and we said no. So then she said, well, can I stop food and drink? And the doctor and the nurse practitioner said, oh, that would be all right, because we don't even know whether she really enjoys it or even wants it. It's just a reflex action when she opens her mouth. And so I'm thinking to myself, this is murder. What are you talking about? You're stopping somebody from eating and drinking, and she didn't even have a problem swallowing. So I went to my spiritual counselor and I said, how do I combat this? So he sent me a long list of things on ethics. And I gave it to the nurse who was working with her at that point. And I said, you push that. And then we also said, you must go to the ethics committee before you make some kind of announcement to the daughter that it's okay to stop food and drink. So at the end of the whole thing, the ethics committee did come down just before they were going to tell the daughter that it was okay to stop drinking and letting her drink and eat. And they said that it was against state law, that you could not stop food and drink of a person who was had Alzheimer's or dementia. But they had to have, why did they have to have somebody come down and tell them? That should have been an automatic thing that they saw it as murder, and nobody saw it as murder except myself and another colleague. Everybody else was in tune with it. So at that point, then I have to think, is this where I want to be? Where somebody can just make an outright choice to cut somebody's life off and not give them a chance until God said it was their time. I just couldn't continue with that. And then the more I pressed to be with the patient and less with the paperwork, the more they hated me. So I ended up having to retire because they pushed me out. So I will continue to think of hospice as a place where people go to die mercifully without pain and all that. But I wonder now where it's heading in the wrong direction, I think. And I worry about that.
Okay, and we're just a few minutes over this time, so let's take a break and come back. Very nice. So let's say 3:20. Okay.